remember me, I'm an assistant vice president of mitigation and resiliency for a company called the Olson Group. I'm also faculty here at Rowan University in New Jersey and online at American Military University, where I've been teaching for about 20 years, 21 years. So we're going to talk about what is public health and its roles. We're going to talk about preparedness, and really many people kind of wonder, including people in public health, how they fit into the paradigm of preparedness. Because after all, don't you just deal with smoking cessation and epidemiology and infectious disease? And we've learned a lot about public health in the last few years. A good trivia question for everyone that I always remind people is, public health is in fact one of the uniformed services of the US government. Believe it or not, public health is, hold on one second, so I guess it would be Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, Coast Guard, Space Force, the US Public Health Service. Does anyone know who the other group is? It's a nice little trivia question. Go ahead and chime in, it's okay. No, the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration. They're actually sworn commission officers of the federal government. Just like a military branch, where uniforms, the whole bit. So US Public Health Service, the commission core of the US Public Health Service, is in fact a uniform service that provides essential services. There's a lot of speculation on why they're a commission core or uniform service. One of the reasons, to be quite honest, is because many governments, many societies have identified public health as an absolute national security issue. There is a risk and vulnerability to these kinds of things. So imagine, for example, that if I really want to affect a population at war, I adulterate their food. I interfere with environmental factors. So that's why public health really has a gambit of authority that nobody really thinks about, including, believe it or not, public health has what is generally referred to as policing powers. And we'll talk about that for a bit. The difference is, so that I can be clear, because I am being taped and I don't want to confuse anyone. The difference is when public health does an enforcement action, it can only enforce that restriction, caveat, rule until the threat is mitigated. They can't be punitive in their policing action, if that makes sense. And you might have heard the expressions of Typhoid Mary, for example. There really was such a person. They were in New York and they were arrested eventually because they refused to be inoculated and they continued to spread typhoid. So therefore they were arrested until the time that they were no longer a threat to the community. Then they had to be released, or detained, I guess might be the better word. But we're going to talk a little bit about all the things that public health does, because most people are pretty surprised. We'll talk a little bit about biologicals, because let's face it, bioweaponry, bio detection, bio concerns has dominated the conversation also for the last 22, actually almost 30 years now, because it goes before 9/11. So public health is an organized system, like any system that's federal, state, and community-based. Most public health functionality and authorities come from the community, even though there is legal laws, legal conditions and capabilities at the state, federal, and local level. Federal investigators, for example, I started my career actually as an investigator for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And we had both Title 18 authority, criminal authority to prosecute someone who willfully committed fraud or adulterated product. But we also had affidavit authority. We could take testimony and go after people. And you can imagine all the regulatory rules that public health has to follow and that public health has authority over. If it is an imminent risk to health, safety, welfare, if it's environmental, if there's a known condition which can harm public health at the state or local or federal level, has the ability to deal with things. Now, there are times when public health can even seize product. They can go in and seize product being imported or being shipped that's adulterated or can cause a danger. And you've heard of recalls, and most recalls are voluntary. because let's face it, that's the best compliance. But actually, public health can mandate at the local level and take and seize product that is a danger to the public.
Excuse me, Anthony, just a quick question. When you say public health, you are referring to whom exactly?
Well, the broad authority of public health in general. So at the federal level, it's the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. At the local level, it is, and you're raising a question I want to get to so in a second. At the local level, most jurisdictions have Emergency Health Powers Acts, or they have Public Health and Nuisance Acts, depending on the jurisdiction, and they've been brought out over the year. But public health as an entity has these authorities. Usually it's assigned to the commissioner or the department, and the department then regulates whom is issued that responsibility or authority. So when I worked at the state health department, for example, and I worked in bioterrorism and biologic preparedness, we had credentials as public health investigators so that we can make entry and interact with the public, or interact with law enforcement and the public. And that's an important distinction. So while not everyone has arrest powers or detention powers or whatever you want to call them, or seizure powers, certain entities had that authority, certain individuals, based upon their role within the department. And the reason I say it's a really good question that you asked, Diego, is because all law enforcement, all public safety have enabling authorities that allow them to do things and not do things. In the United States, we are very clearly defined as the scope and authority. Not every police officer can enforce all the laws of the land. It's unusual. For example, a police officer might not in a local town have the authority to enforce animal welfare laws. Now, most do, but just a generic thing. Animal welfare laws, by the way, is a public health function, believe it or not. So when those animal control officers come out, most of them are under a public health authority of some sort. And I'll get into why in a minute. So the primary focus is to care for the community in public health, not the individual. Everything that public health does is to care for the systemic community as a whole, not the primary care of the individual. That's left to entities who provide, and I assume you're seeing my big screen, correct? Yeah, that's up to entities like doctors and healthcare providers. Public health generally is not a healthcare provider, even though they might have clinical services to address a sector of the community that might need help. And why is that important? Because in a pandemic, for example, you're now issuing the regulations, and you might also have a service care responsibility if you have both of those divisions within your public health. So public health is really extremely broad. It is my passion, I have to admit, even though I've moved on in my career. That's code for I've gotten old. But national civil defense pattern that you're familiar with is the idea of the individuals and that disasters are local, followed by family, community, neighborhood, even adjoining cities and mutual aid at state and federal level. Public health is absolutely no different. The only caveat might be that public health may not exist in the municipality as a business, as an entity, as a corporate element or a community element. They might contract their services. In this town where I live, for example, we have a municipal board of public health. They simply issue policy and review issues, but the county is the enforcing authority for that local public health. So we contract with the county. There's some interesting things that public health does, but I thought I'd kind of address the elephant in the room to begin with, and that is this whole thing of pandemic. You know, we've been dealing with something called a novel virus now for a couple of years. It's been overwhelming to our society. It's been globally overwhelming. A novel virus very simply means it's new, it's emerging, we've not known it before. So the reason it was so important to this conversation is because, especially in emergency preparedness, is because if, for example, there's this novel virus, COVID, and it's not been seen before, it really is difficult to create a threat profile and to know what this virus might do. And that's exactly what occurred here, is that We knew some things about the SARS virus, but we didn't know how this particular COVID, which was novel, would react with the public, and how the public and interactions with the community, how we could best mitigate. We have some general tools in our toolbox in public health, but how we went about it is a little unusual. And to give you an understanding, so avian virus is obviously bird virus. There is a variety of different viruses that humans have and that animals have. And as long as they stay separate or within that group, we're okay to some degree. We can manage them. Where things get very complicated is when a virus becomes what is known as zoonotic. When it can freely transfer between humans and animals, all bets are off. Because think about it. If a rodent has a disease and a rodent travels 6 miles away, it's spreading that virus. It's becoming a vector for that virus to be transmitted. If birds do it and they migrate and they have an infection, again, that virus can readily spread. If it can also affect humans, now you could see the complication. So public health has the role not only to do surveillance on human infections and symptoms, but animal infections and symptoms, especially if we know that there's the potential for something to start to migrate, and we never know when that'll be. Bird flu or avian flu, H1N1, H1N5. We watched all of those very, very carefully because we just didn't know when they were going to flip over. The coronavirus, for example, we know came from an animal. There seems to be a little bit of debate as to which animal, but we know that it either was transmitted through avian, through bats, which is a mammal, or through, and I'm sorry, I keep forgetting it's not a platypus, I keep forgetting the name of that small animal that is also a mammal, but it came through the mammalian side and into humans. And that's why it's a big concern. So I wanted to show this, that becomes really it. So there are some assumptions also in this preparedness. So let's look about public health and let's get these assumptions out of the way. First of all, many people in public health say, oh, they don't need to know NIMS, the National Incident Management System. They don't need to use ICS. Particularly think about it. Does a hospital or a doctor's office really need to use ICS? I mean, they provide care. The nurses know what they're doing. The staff knows what they're doing. And the answer is really yes. And I'll tell you why. Because if they're going to interface, if you're going to have resource and logistics and command and control interface across multiple systems, everybody should be using one terminology, one set of rules. Imagine, for example, public health definitions of words like case are very different from those in public safety. Police officers use case and they mean an event. Public health use cases and they mean the individual. So things can get very confusing if we're not using standardized language, standardized management systems for command and control. So hospitals and healthcare meet the responsibility of their patients and patient care. If we just worry, some say if we worry about our facilities, then we don't need to worry about everything else. And I can tell you that a good snowstorm could discredit that very quickly. Because if public health or public safety and emergency management has to shut the roads to the hospital, then it's essential for you to get your employees in. It's not essential for them to go home. And if I shut roads to your hospital off because of some crisis, how am I impacting the ability of you to deliver resources at that facility, or to deliver capabilities? So these are all things that we've got to pay attention to. Health is no need, that some people believe that health has no need to understand the public and the medical, and public health is not medical, public health is simply administrative. No, the better integration of information allows that, or stops that stovepiping and allows us to break down those silos of understanding. Imagine in 2 years now, the best people to deal with this crisis were people that had cross understanding of public health and crisis at the same time, because we could look at community issues as well as policies and procedures of healthcare. Unfortunately, and I could say this even though we're being recorded because I'm no longer in government, my biggest sensitivity is, I've told students this for decades, never have a disaster during a presidential election cycle. And what I often say that because you just can't, when you politicize a disaster, all bets are off. We're no longer acting on the science, we're now acting on a variety of other issues. And to be quite candid, regardless of your ideologies, the fact of the matter is we don't know where the truths are now because it has been so convoluted and confused that we've got to step back and reevaluate the science. But there are some things that we absolutely know about this pandemic. Number one is we know it's an infectious disease, right? We could agree to that. Number two is we know that it's readily spread via aerosolized distribution of droplets, usually sinuses or respiratory. Number three is we know it's an inflammation disease. It'll cause inflammation to the hearts or cardiovascular pulmonary systems. And number four, we know that we have a vaccine. The vaccine has been documented to be highly, highly effective. And there were some sensitivities. One of the sensitivities was, after all, that the vaccine was new. And that's not fair that we should expose ourselves to a new vaccine that might, in fact, be dangerous. Except that's not true. This vaccine's over 20 years old. The technology for the vaccine, I should say, is close to 20 years old. We simply built a vaccine based on this threat, but it took some time. You have to understand, especially in public health, for a vaccine of any capacity to protect you, for it to make it to market or distribution within months is insanely fast. But to say that there was no research behind it is not necessarily true either. So not only do we have a novel disease, we had a novel solution. And so that started to raise questions about the science. That's where some of the misinformation and concerns started to show up. So all of these are actually false. So what is a pandemic? So you've heard the term epidemic versus pandemic. Public health is very important to use terminology properly, like any system. So in public health, we've heard these two words, pandemic and epidemic. And the reality is that we are living in an environment where we are being vulnerable or subjected to a broad global scale event. So it would be considered pandemic. However, an endemic event is what they're now talking about this public health can become. And it concerns people because they don't understand the terminology. So an endemic is a widespread infection in a community or region that might be seasonal, it might be year-round. Pandemic, on the other hand, is a global endemic. This disease was global, no doubt about it. And it is evolving to become endemic because it might be with us for a long, long time. But it is not an epidemic. Epidemic would be to a given area. Endemic, though, means, so there's endemic, epidemic, pandemic. This is a pandemic that is evolving to an endemic event, which means it will be with us for a long time. And we will have, like the flu, it'll come around and come around. The problem with this disease is, with COVID, is the data is telling us that it really is not as susceptible as the flu to things like cold temperature and the like. Whereas flu kind of cycles, COVID has stayed fairly consistent as a risk during different cycles. So, background and scope and objectives. This is the kind of documents that go out. Public health has been doing emergency planning for a long, long time. This is just one example, mass fatality management guide. And people don't think about it, but you know, if I've got a large population, even if I have 10 people in a small town or 5 people in a small town, do I have systems to address fatality management? And that's a public health role as well. How do we deal with decedents and investigate decedents? Medical examiners in many jurisdictions are either under the enforcement side or they are under public health, which is why medical examiners and that genre is called medical legal functionality, excuse me. But next of kin notifications, these are all the things that have to be thought about. And there's even appendices to all of this so that we can look at how we interface with public health and other things like community-wide systems, response capability. Public health does have a response functionality. Excuse me. HIPAA, the Health Information Portability Act. Well, HIPAA is interesting, and how do we play that role? Because some information can't be shared. Some information public health can share, but there are rules internal and there are rules for confidentiality, which is why, for example, in the pandemic, a small town in Delaware couldn't get information on who actually was infected, because if they gave information out, it might tip the hand as to who the individuals are, and that would interfere with confidentiality. Refrigeration, storage, medical and behavioral issues, medical legal issues, religious and cultural concerns. For example, depending on the religious background of an individual, there may be requirements for how remains are handled. So when we do mass fatality planning, we have to look at those things. There's even time cycles. Certain religions require burial within 48 hours. So we have to have, and all of this goes into planning. So when we say that planning may not have existed, it really did. So let's talk about some of the challenges that we face. Personal, well, you could see, look at the pandemic and how many personal issues we had and concerns we had. School, work, unemployment, all of these things are very personal, as well as your risk as an individual to exposure. And if we couldn't provide you information that was adequate to exposure, or if that information became less credible over time, or there was an issue of credibility, imagine that over time, then it becomes a vulnerability because we're not providing you enough information. Community services and interruptions. During pandemic, it's possible that 20 to 30% of population might become sick or unavailable to work. Depending on the significance of the strain, up to half the population may be absent from work. What we didn't expect was the broad shutdown of employment and economy at one time. Generally, we and I'm speaking for myself, my vision of a pandemic always was more regional than global at one time. This disease caused everything to shut down. So the community impact was fairly severe, as well as even the simplest things like how do we distribute food? How do we distribute commodity and resources necessary to maintain healthcare or care of any type? Healthcare was impacted, obviously, and remains impacted still. The system was overwhelmed. Healthcare workers, nurses, aides, doctors are extremely overwhelmed by this disease. And not so much now, but in the last 2 years, it has been relentless. And to see that much death and that much injury and that much harm has its impact on people. So that's where that's kind of coming from. Also, overwhelming systems to vaccines, to medications, distribution. We saw over the holidays, and that, again, this slide is from 7 years ago when I first started teaching pandemic preparedness. So why at Christmas or Thanksgiving and Christmas, the holidays, why did we not anticipate that in fact this could easily turn into a problem if we didn't have enough tests? We should have anticipated that and addressed it accordingly. So community strategies, you've heard, social distance, isolation, vaccination. These are all things that have been in place for decades. This is how we know to mitigate things like flu on a given year. Social distancing includes a variety of things, but my opinion is I can't really isolate. Well, I can isolate if I'm sick. I can't really quarantine if I've been exposed, if I don't know that I've been exposed, if there's not enough testing. And in the beginning, there was very little testing. The other part of this is social distancing. I really can't social distance and make that decision as to whether or not to wear a mask, as to whether or not to go to the movies or to church, if I don't have information as to the threat and risk. That risk profile becomes an essential tool in compliance. There are 10 functions to public health. This always grabs people's attention. Public health has a responsibility to monitor health systems, diagnose and investigate, inform and educate, mobilize, develop policies and procedures. Public health does enforce laws, the operational side of the arm. They even have healthcare and clinical responsibilities in some place. It is supposed to be research-based. And that is very, very important, that public health works on a research or evidence-based process. And there's also worker compliance and all of these things to make sure that we have assessment of the threat, policy development, and enforcement or compliance, which it calls assurance on the slide. This is what's really needed. This is what public health personnel do on a daily basis at all levels of skill set. This is what a traditional public health element can look like. This is one division. This is a generic term. So surveillance division might look at clinical surveillance. They might look at epidemiology, meaning looking at what threats and trends and patterns. During the original days of biologic threat, terrorism. I remember I come from New Jersey and we handle the anthrax scenario here. We're looking on a regular basis at what kind of people, for example, or how many people were presenting at the hospital with gastrointestinal issues. How many people might have chicken pox or smallpox. And obviously that raises concern if it's A or B. We also need to look at records of data. How many people are dying? How many people are sick? What kind of cause of deaths? What trends, patterns, and indicators might there be to help us understand the public health environment or profile of our community? And that's a big part in public health operations. Public health does have police powers, as I said. They can enforce or close places. They can limit license and discipline health professions. They can, so movement of people. Look at all these things and think about the pandemic and how these came into play. So there was an argument as to whether or not public health can close businesses. Well, they can if the business is shown to be a risk for public health, safety, and welfare. And the problem became, we have what level of government had that authority? Local public health, state public health. Policing powers are not uniform to every level of government. So it wasn't so much could public health do it, it was more about could public health do it at what level, shut things down, move people around, limit exposures. The other part of it is how long is a disaster? And that was a really interesting question. In some of the court cases, they didn't argue public health authority. They argued that 6 months or a year and a half afterwards, somebody should have figured out a way to address it. And that's where some of that argument comes from. And I'm not a lawyer, but these are legitimate conversations as to, remember I said, public health can only enforce or utilize their police power as long as a threat is present, affiliated or connected with what they're doing. So we see public health is still, for example, limiting planes, trains, modes of transportation. We see that, which is because it's interstate, it's the feds that can control that. But records and hospital reports and information, what's reportable? What is required to be reportable? There are certain diseases where the healthcare provider must report it to the public health authority immediately, within 24 hours, within 48 hours, because they must be able to address trends and patterns of concerns. How else are we going to know if there's an attack in this country from a biologic? And I know that sounds far-fetched, but unfortunately it's occurred in the last 20 years easily. How do we know if there's an outbreak of botulism in some prepared foods, since we rely so heavily on a food chain that uses a lot of prepared and stored foods? So these are all legitimate things. Who typed in something? I'm not always able to see that. You're welcome to talk, by the way. During the pandemic, yes, during the pandemic, there are countries that collaborated together. That also raised a big stink, by the way, because it is the World Health Organization's functionality to do that collaboration, not just in enforcement and compliance, but in research and determining and understanding what exactly is going on. So it does seem that the lay people were not prepared. And I agree with you. Everyone was not prepared for the duration and the exposure and the timing. I think we also weren't prepared for the political implications of this crisis. It seems that we were flying the plane and building it at the same time to some degree, but there were some fundamental things that we knew. It just was a fear of implementing things. I literally, the summer before the pandemic, I cleaned out my offices and literally threw away the documents. We have had pandemic plans in place since at least 2005. And we have had public health response systems in place, things like mass prophylaxis, distribution, points of distribution. We've had them in place since 2001 because we prepared them just in case of a pandemic, or of a biologic attack. But if you really want to be honest, we have had portable hospitals and prepackaged hospitals, which today's modern is the Strategic National Stockpile. They've been stored around the country for, since the 1940s. What we did is we modernized it by getting rid of old stuff and learning a new system where we can store materials that might be needed and rotate it on a regular basis, what is called a vendor managed inventory, so that it wasn't sitting there growing old and no longer useful. It was being rotated so that a percentage of stock was available. There are countries that were very ill prepared, but that's a choice. I don't mean to be coy in that, but it is. Most public agencies have powers to take action against an entity, against workers, as long as they are within the scope of risk. Criminal prosecution is what's very unlikely unless there's a willful or deliberate effort. So, quarantine versus isolation, another thing that often gets confused. CDC defines isolation and quarantine. Isolation is the separation of a contagious person or individual from everybody else. There is no doubt that if you've been exposed to COVID and you are symptomatic, you should be isolated for a period of time until you're no longer a risk to yourself and others, predominantly others. It's much easier to implement if we have this conversation in the guise of quarantine. Quarantine is where you restrict the activities of exposed individuals to something. It is interesting to me that we kind of tried to quarantine society as a whole, whether they were exposed or not. We told people stay home, don't go to work, da, da, da. And that's where some of this was trying to get a foothold on understanding what was going on. The concept was to try to slow things down so that we could get a handle on the science of what was going on, but extremely difficult to implement and maintain, as we've learned over the last few years. Quarantine measures include things like suspending public gatherings. You've seen all this, right? And even today, there's some restriction of travel. There is some scientific basis, and that's where we have to keep considering isolation or quarantine. It has to be based on what we know, whether it's a biologic agent, whether it's a naturally occurring disease. We need to have a science that justifies the process. Unfortunately, it's not always practical and feasible. And we have to have the societal discussion about benefit versus risk. And after 2 years and a destruction of, or a major damage to the economy, does it now justify? Have we reached a point with such amount of population vaccinated? Have we reached the point of The benefit now of quarantining and shutting down society outweighs the risk. But what we have to do, and this is why vaccination becomes so important, we had to get to a level where a majority of the population was not at risk from serious disease. I don't think anybody cares if you get cold-like symptoms. One of the problems that we don't know is even if you get flu-like symptoms, which all biologists kind of present as flu-like symptoms, the issue is not whether or not I can be resilient to COVID today. The issue is if I get COVID 6 years from now, what will this strand do to me respiratory wise? And you're hearing the discussion about something called long COVID in that respect. Public health systems of preparedness, response, and recovery are to prepare, plan, same as emergency management, training systems, detection. No, people don't realize that public health has a whole system for syndromatic surveillance. Symptomatic surveillance is looking and working with hospitals and healthcare systems to determine if there's some kind of outbreak emerging based on the symptoms that are being reported from the diagnostic systems in our communities. If I see 50 people showing up at a hospital, they're all at a wedding and all of them have stomach flu, well, you know, maybe I might have a foodborne illness there, and that's where that comes, the simplest form to the more complex, to looking at the potential of an attack. So terrorism is a reality. It is something to consider. Biologics are a concern because they are a very easy, naturally occurring toxin or system that can impact us. So we've built a system to look at some of the risk and the more common, but botulism can be used. Anthrax is found commonly in soils in some parts of the country. It's a spore. You might have heard of something called Shearer's disease. That's actually anthrax from the dirt onto the animal, from the animal to the person that's doing the shearing of the animal. So challenges in bioterrorism is that mostly with bioterrorism, public health has to be concerned with delayed onset. Public health is not going to see a biological attack at the moment it occurs. It might take days or even weeks for the symptoms and the trend and pattern to mature, even if particularly if it's spread out wide. Somebody goes to a football game like the Super Bowl, contaminated, and all those people go home. You're now looking at symptomatology from all over the country, not a given community. The rarity of natural disease, we need to know and compare an attack versus a natural disease, because most of these are going to appear as generally as flu-like symptoms. The difference with a biological attack or bioterrorism is it's going to be persistent and come with other issues. And we have to have a communication system to be able to share information. An epidemiologist in New York has to be able to talk to an epidemiologist in Alaska to find out if there's a trend and pattern, and they have to be able to share that information. And biologics can easily be used as a weapon. They're colorless, they're odorless, and the most toxic element known to humans that can do the most damage is actually a biologic. It's a toxin, and they come in different forms. So we need to look at biologics. And there's some interesting things that we know right off the bat. We know that, for example, biologics at 1 to 5 microns in size, they're very, very small. So if I have a filter system that's less than 1 or 0.05 micron, which an N95 mask is, then it's, or 0.1 micron, or 1 micron, sorry. The N95 mask, the reason it's called the 95 mask is because the N95 mask filters 95% of particulate matter. It's really what that's the definition. And we have to look at weather. Weather impacts biologics and distribution of biologics, and pH level. If its pH is above 4 or below 9, okay, but if it's below 4 or above 9, if it's a base or a caustic, it's not likely a biologic can survive in the environment. We're looking at clustering of morbidity, of injury and fatality. We're looking at normal, healthy people and animals and how all of a sudden they might be impacted or affected. Areas, there's been a video that's been going around the internet for about a week now of a bunch of birds that just all of a sudden fell out of the sky. How could 1,000 birds just die at a moment's notice in a square block? And so now that raises a concern. That's an unusual thing. Remember, normalcy and abnormalcy still works. So these are where epidemiologists get their clues. They're looking for morbidity and mortality and respiratory. And they're looking for symptoms and trends and patterns and symptoms to know how these things might impact our community. They're also looking for the unusual and the oddity. Diseases have a pattern. There's a prodromal stage, there's a process of how symptoms mature. And if all of a sudden they're different or odd, that raises some suspicion and concern. And I talked about toxins. There are 3 types or categories of toxins and agents. And so, but these are very serious. The first one being the most serious, botulinum toxin, smallpox, those kinds of things, tularemia. These are really serious versus the less things like yellow fever and other types of agents that can harm. And this is what public health has to get right all the time. Category A, high mortality. Category A, agents, anthrax, smallpox, botulism, plague. If these appear in any form, any level, they're automatically presumed to be a concern. One case of smallpox or one case of plague triggers an activation of a variety of systems. Category B agents are those that are easily transferable. There is a lesser risk of disease and harm, but there are concerns and it can spread readily. And then there's category C. So these are all things that we pay attention to. There's the victim, by the way, and also the perpetrator. That is what disease looks like. So what you're seeing there is a smallpox vaccination site. You're seeing, I believe that might be anthrax on that skin, but I think this is all smallpox, to be honest with you. Don't confuse it with chickenpox. So we use terms too. Mass prophylaxis is a term that's commonly used. It's a preventative treatment. So mass prophylaxis is a nice word for vaccination. That's an example. Taking antibiotics. When we had the anthrax case here in New Jersey, we literally gave all the postal employees under doctor's order and public health doctor's order, Cipro, a very strong antibiotic. The problem is it also makes you very sick because it's a very strong antibiotic. It makes it makes you pretty queasy. So we had to balance these things out, risk versus reward. Points of distribution is one of the resources available to us. Points of distribution, you've heard, it's the ability to be able to readily distribute vaccines and other resources as the need becomes present. It's great that we created a vaccine, for example, for COVID. The problem became, how do we distribute it? Do we go through doctors and hospitals? Do we set up distribution? That's where you saw public health service, you saw military, a lot of federal agencies came to bring resources to local government to set up mass distribution or mass vaccination sites. They were called points of dispensing. We've been planning for those for years. And actually, the incident command system even has pods in its SIG, point of distribution of dispensing. It is part of the process. Hard to talk about public health and have a cough at the same time. So I talked about the strategic national stockpile. We do maintain a cadre and resource of supplies in an emergency. It's the national stockpile. There's also the ChemPack, which is another type of reserve resource to be distributed in time of crisis. It is managed by the Center for Disease Control, coordinated by states. It is the ability to respond to chemical and biological threats, and is very, very valuable. Where the concern is keep in mind that just because I have it in a warehouse doesn't mean it's being maintained forever, especially if it's vaccines or medicines, they have to be temperature controlled and regulated and inspected, and they have a shelf life. So we've got to, make sure that any of those materials that are consumable, that they are reviewed, processed, assessed on a regular basis. So when pandemic first hit, for example, when COVID first hit, one of the concerns was we went into the stockpile to pull respirators. People needed to be on respirators. The problem is that the respirators, while there, hadn't been maintained in a long time. So the question or concern became, how do we go ahead and allow this to occur and not occur again? So now we had to create new systems. But imagine if I've got tens of thousands of respirators on standby, sitting there idle for years at a time. There's a cost of millions of dollars to maintain them. The batteries have a shelf life. There's a lot of consumable threat there that has to be addressed. There is a 12-hour push package, and where these are located is confidential, but they're located throughout the country so that they can be readily deployed within 4 to 6 hours of an area of potential harm. So 12-hour push package gets there. It's containerized in cargo. Think of containerized trucks delivering them, and they're broken down and distributed even further to the municipality. And it could be anything, including nitrile gloves and masks, for example. They're huge. They even come with their own protective system, protective agencies. National stockpile push package is color coded, so we know what we're opening, what it's for. There is a logic to all of this. It includes pharmaceuticals, it includes IV supplies, airways, ventilators, bandages. We are ready to supplement the medical systems that are in place. But like any emergency plan, somebody's got to know when to push the button. There's something called vendor managed inventory as well. Vendor managed inventory is simply the same type of system, but we use the same type of system, but we use it with the private sector to help manage the inventory, rotating the stock and the like. It's a much smaller cadre of resources, but can be available within 24 to 36 hours, readily available to help support systems. And I admit I'm in New Jersey where a lot of these vendors are, so it's helpful, but they're located throughout the country, so they're predisposed, pre-warehoused. Mass prophylaxis and treatment, as we've talked about already. The biggest problem that we had is keeping records. How do we have a record system that tells us what's going on and who was vaccinated and how they're doing it? And I'm fascinated now because there are the vaccine cards, which heck if I know where mine is, but there's also vaccine software. So in New Jersey, for example, the State Department of Health issued software for a smartphone so that my vaccine records now are on my phone. So if somebody goes, I need proof you're vaccinated, it literally is on my phone, including a letter from the state health department that can be downloaded in PDF so that individuals can have it, employers can have it, and the like. BioWatch and biohazard detection systems. There have been systems in place for 25 years to detect whether or not biologics have been released into the environment. They're early warning systems, they're confidential in nature, but they monitor air to look at risk and vulnerability and the potential airborne release of threats to our society. Key features, it allows us, and you can see it's been there since 2003. It's federally funded and managed. They're throughout the country in high hazard areas. That's just an example of what it might look like, and the systems have changed over 20 years, but it also has a laboratory support system so that we know the collection assessment, and it's a standardized assessment so that we know, for example, that a lab has reviewed this and is using a standard protocol to determine something. There is biohazard detection systems also in the post office. Remember that the anthrax that was in our country was sent via the mail. So the US Post Office now looks at all mail, and this says just for anthrax, but that's no longer true. They look for a variety of things being shipped through the mail, and they're able within 60 minutes to recall all the mail and assess a threat. And that number probably has gone down significantly since this is back in the day when PCR systems were very complex. Now we can look at systems in far less time. But that's what it looks like. As the mail gets, that's a mail sorter. And that little box there is what's taking air samples, and that little round tube there takes air samples as the stamp on the thing is canceled, and that puff of air is what it's assessing so that we can determine if biologics were mailed. And there's a whole plan and protocol in place to deal with it. So the bottom line is community vigilance. We have to plan together, train together, inform and educate, and build response systems that are integrated and effective in meeting the public's needs. This makes perfect sense since this is emergency management at its core. And I do highlight the word together because that's really what this is all about. Public health is a player at the table, needs to be part of the process. And they have to be willing to be part of the process, sharing resources and coordination for effective health safety and to assure the resiliency of a community. I think that's all I got.